We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
Princess Anne had expected an ordinary private review of family papers. Instead, a newly opened group of letters carrying Prince Philip's unmistakable personal instructions delivered a revelation that left her stunned. Wood Farm, the quiet Sandringham refuge so closely connected to his final years, had not been emotionally entrusted to the person many inside the family assumed. Philip had chosen Lady Louise Windsor, and the reason buried inside those letters made the discovery far more personal than property alone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne read the decisive passage once. Then she read it again. Her fingers remained against the page as the words settled into something impossible to dismiss. Sandringham is the royal family's privately owned country estate in Norfolk, separate from properties held for the crown, and Wood Farm had become one of its most deeply personal corners during Philip's later years. There, away from the constant demands of ceremony, the Duke had found privacy, independence, and a rhythm that felt unmistakably his own. Anne understood that better than most. She had always believed the farm belonged emotionally to the final chapter of her father's life, which made the instruction before her feel less like a property decision and more like a message sent directly across the years. The documented correspondence left no room for misunderstanding. Philip had written that Louise should become the guardian of Wood Farm's character, protecting the place from being reshaped into another symbol of royal status. The word guardian mattered. He was not simply handing over walls, land, or possessions. He was placing trust in the granddaughter he believed would preserve what the farm represented. Anne slowly lowered the letter onto the table and said nothing. Her silence carried the shock. Her father had made a deliberate choice, and he had kept that choice from the people closest to him. Louise reacted very differently when the contents were explained to her in a private family conversation. She did not smile. She did not treat the decision as a triumph. Instead, the younger royal immediately understood what had been placed between herself and Anne. Philip's letters gave her responsibility for a place tied to his final years, but they also forced her to carry the emotional weight of being chosen over expectations that had existed long before she knew anything about his plan. Then came the second blow. In another documented letter, Philip explained why he had stayed silent. He feared that discussing Wood Farm too early would allow family assumptions, expectations, and quiet pressure to harden around it, before Louise ever had the chance to decide freely. Anne stared at that reasoning with growing pain. The question was no longer whether her father had chosen Louise. The letters had settled that. The question was why he believed his granddaughter understood something about Wood Farm that even his own daughter might not. To understand why that choice cut so deeply, the family first had to confront the extraordinary bond Philip had quietly built with Louise. Lady Louise Windsor had never occupied the loudest place inside the royal family. That may have been exactly why Philip noticed her. Away from succession battles, ceremonial rivalries, and public expectation, grandfather and granddaughter developed a quieter connection, built around horses, carriage driving, patience, and work. Now Anne was being forced to examine that relationship from a completely different angle, and to wonder whether Philip had been preparing Louise for Wood Farm long before anyone understood what he was doing. Anne could not stop returning to the same memories. Louise had grown up as the daughter of Prince Edward and Sophie, but her life had carried less public weight than many around her. Carriage driving became one of the strongest links between the young royal and her grandfather. The sport involves controlling horses, pulling a carriage through precise movements, and demanding conditions, and Philip had treated it seriously for decades. He did not flatter Louise. He corrected her. He expected concentration, patience, and resilience. She kept returning anyway. Anne remembered one afternoon with uncomfortable clarity. Louise came back from time, with Philip carrying muddy gloves, tired but attentive, as he explained where she had lost control during a difficult turn. At the time, Anne had thought nothing of it. Now the scene felt different. Philip had not been simply teaching a granddaughter to handle horses. He had been watching how she reacted to criticism, responsibility, and work. Louise listened without complaint, and he noticed. Edward understood the danger immediately. Pride flickered through him when he learned what his father had written, but it was quickly replaced by caution. In a quiet family conversation, he told Louise that Wood Farm must never become something she believed she had won. Anne was hurting, he reminded her, and Philip's choice could easily be misunderstood as a judgment against his own children. Louise agreed. The responsibility frightened her far more than it excited her. Sophie saw that fear when the two sat alone after the letters were explained. Louise admitted that accepting Philip's wish might look like disrespect toward Anne, especially because the farm had carried such private meaning during his final years. Her mother did not dismiss that fear. She told her that responsibility often becomes painful precisely because it matters. Louise listened, but the weight remained. Then another documented letter sharpened everything. Philip described Louise as someone who understands usefulness before display. The words revealed exactly what he had valued. Another instruction made clear that Wood Farm was never supposed to become a ceremonial residence, a home used mainly for royal display, formal hosting, or status. He wanted privacy preserved. He wanted simplicity protected. Anne finally understood that her father had been measuring character, not rank. But the letters contained something even more uncomfortable. Philip's choice had not begun near the end of his life. It had started years earlier. After one small family incident, almost everyone else had forgotten. That moment, almost forgotten at the time, would become the hidden trigger behind Philip's final decision. The decisive moment did not happen during a legal meeting or behind the doors of Buckingham Palace. It happened during a quiet family visit at Sandringham, when Philip watched Louise do something so small that almost everyone else forgot it. He did not. According to the newly uncovered correspondence, that single afternoon changed how he thought about Wood Farm. Years later, Anne would look back at the same incident and realize her father had been making a judgment no one knew was taking place. Philip had come to value the quieter rhythm of Wood Farm during his later years. The property gave him distance from the constant formality surrounding royal life, and that mattered because he had always preferred usefulness over ceremony. Louise occasionally joined him around carriage-driving activities, but what caught his attention was not simply her interest in the sport. She noticed the practical routines around him. She asked about equipment. She listened when something needed repairing. She treated the place as somewhere to respect, not somewhere to impress. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. A leaking stable roof interrupted a family visit shortly after a driving session, sending everyone into hurried movement as rain began threatening the equipment below. Louise did not follow the others out. She stayed behind, helped move harnesses and tools away from the leaking section, and insisted that the oldest carriage tack be protected before anyone bothered with her own belongings. The tack, the straps, reins, and equipment used to control and secure horses, carried years of use and memory. Philip watched her protect it without being asked. Anne remembered what happened afterward with painful clarity. Philip asked her, almost casually, whether younger members of the family still understood stewardship. Stewardship meant caring for something responsibly, without treating it as a personal prize. She answered confidently that duty could always be taught. At the time, the question had seemed ordinary. Years later, with the letters in front of her, Anne understood that her father had already begun making a judgment. Philip recorded that judgment in a dated letter written shortly after the incident. He wrote that Louise protected things because they mattered, not because they belonged to her. That single line struck Anne harder than the property decision itself. Her father had not been searching for an heir in the traditional sense. He had been looking for someone whose instinct matched his own. Another documented note went even further. Philip instructed that his intention concerning Wood Farm should remain private until after his death. He feared that early knowledge would place pressure on Louise, distort her behavior, and turn a quiet act of trust into a family contest before she ever understood what was being asked of her. Anne could now follow the logic from beginning to end. She could see the leaking roof, the protected tack, the question about stewardship, and the letters that followed. On paper, it made sense, but accepting Philip's reasoning was one thing. Accepting Louise face to face was something else entirely. And when aunt and niece finally meet alone, years of loyalty to the same man collide across a single table. There were no courtiers in the room when Princess Anne finally faced Lady Louise. No advisors, no palace officials. Just two women connected by the same man and divided by what he had left behind. Louise entered expecting anger. Anne entered determined not to show pain. But when Philip's name was spoken, the careful distance between them collapsed. What followed was not a fight over a house. It was a confrontation over memory, loyalty, and who Philip truly trusted. Anne had insisted on the meeting before anyone else was allowed to shape the conversation. She wanted no intermediaries, no softened language, and no family message passed through private secretaries. A private secretary is the senior aide who manages a royal's official work and communications. But Anne wanted none of that machinery between them. Louise understood why. Wood Farm was not simply another property attached to Sandringham. It had been part of Philip's final private world, and accepting responsibility for it could easily look as though she had stepped into a place his own children believed was emotionally theirs. Anne asked the question without hesitation. Had Louise known? Had Philip ever hinted that Wood Farm might one day be placed in her care? Louise answered immediately. No. She said she had never been warned, never been prepared, and never been asked to keep such a secret. More importantly, she told her aunt that she would never have hidden something so personal from her. Anne listened carefully, but the pain did not disappear. Instead, it finally surfaced. Anne admitted that Wood Farm carried the version of her father she remembered without ceremony, wrapped around him. There, Philip had been less a royal figure and more simply himself. That was why the decision hurt. Louise heard the difference at once. Her aunt was not arguing over ownership. She was grieving a private connection she feared had been reassigned. Louise pushed her chair back slightly and stopped protecting herself. If accepting Wood Farm meant damaging Philip's family, she said, then she would walk away from it. Completely. She would rather surrender the place than allow her grandfather's final wish to become a permanent wound between people who loved him. Anne did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another documented letter. Philip had anticipated exactly this moment. In the letter, he wrote that Louise's willingness to give up what she had been handed was one of the reasons she could be trusted with it in the first place. Anne read the passage aloud, then lowered the paper. Something changed. Louise had just reacted exactly as Philip believed she would. And Anne suddenly realized her father had understood not only his granddaughter's character, but perhaps even the pain his daughter would feel. The confrontation softened, but it did not solve everything, because emotion was only one half of what Philip had left behind. The emotional argument was only half the battle. The next question was whether Philip had left Louise merely a sentiment or real authority. The family could debate Philip's feelings. They could not easily dismiss his instructions. Buried alongside the personal letters was a carefully structured set of directions concerning Wood Farm's use, maintenance, and future. That changed everything. What appeared at first to be an emotional wish now carried a framework designed to survive disagreement. And as the wording was read aloud, Anne understood something crucial. Her father had not simply chosen Louise. He had anticipated resistance and built his decision around it. Charles took control of the review because the question had moved beyond emotion. Wood Farm sat inside the wider Sandringham estate, the privately owned royal estate in Norfolk, which meant Philip's wishes had to distinguish between who cared for the property, who could live there, and who handled the larger estate around it. Those were not the same powers. Senior members of the family gathered to hear the papers read together, so nobody could later claim that one person had twisted the meaning. Anne sat through every line. Louise remained quiet. Edward watched both of them. Charles reached the decisive instruction and stopped. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the file, and read the passage once more before speaking. His father's intention, he said quietly, appeared unmistakable. Louise was to hold primary responsibility for preserving Wood Farm's private character. That responsibility did not mean absolute ownership over every part of Sandringham. It meant stewardship, the duty to protect and manage something without treating it as a personal trophy. The distinction mattered, but it did little to soften the force of Philip's choice. Anne felt the finality immediately. She did not attack Louise. She did not challenge her niece's character. Instead, she asked whether Philip had protected the family's ability to return to the place that had meant so much to him. Her concern was painful but precise. If Louise became the guardian of Wood Farm, Anne wanted to know whether preserving Philip's memory would somehow mean restricting the people who had shared that memory with him. Edward understood what his sister was really asking. He watched Anne closely and recognized that this was not a struggle for control. She was grieving the possibility of losing access to a private part of her father. Louise understood it too, and the tension in the room changed. Then Charles reached the clause that settled the fear. Philip had explicitly protected family access while giving Louise responsibility for the farm's character. Another provision prevented major alterations without consultation. Rooms could not simply be transformed. Its purpose could not be quietly rewritten. Philip had designed the arrangement so Wood Farm would remain recognizable long after he was gone. Anne finally had her answer. Her father had not shut the family out. He had chosen one person to protect the door. But responsibility written on paper was easier than responsibility lived in real life. Philip had made the decision difficult to overturn. Louise now had to decide whether she was strong enough to live with it. Lady Louise did not celebrate when she finally accepted Philip's wish. She cried. The decision placed no crown on her head, gave her no new public rank, and offered none of the glamour usually associated with royal inheritance. Instead, it handed her responsibility for one of her grandfather's most personal refuges, and forced everyone around her to accept that Philip had seen something in Louise that he wanted protected after his death. Louise agreed to take responsibility for Wood Farm under the conditions written into Philip's documented instructions. She made one thing clear immediately. She would preserve the property, not possess it. Stewardship meant caring for something on behalf of a wider legacy, rather than treating it as personal property. And that distinction now defined everything. The family was told that no immediate changes would be made. The rooms, routines, and private character connected to Philip would remain untouched, while the arrangement settled. Louise stepped away from the family discussion, carrying more weight than relief. Sophie found her afterward, and the younger royal finally admitted what she had been holding back. She felt as though Philip had handed her a piece of himself that she was terrified of dropping. Her mother listened without trying to soften the truth. The responsibility was heavy because the bond had been real. Louise was not frightened of managing a house. She was frightened of failing the man who had trusted her. Anne heard those words and stopped. Until that moment, part of her had still feared that Wood Farm might become a symbol of preference, a quiet statement that Philip had valued one branch of the family over another. Louise's confession changed that. Her niece did not sound victorious. She sounded burdened. For the first time, Anne understood that the choice had created pain on both sides. Anne later returned to the letter alone. She touched the edge of the page, folded it carefully, and asked for a copy, rather than raising another objection. The gesture was small, but it marked a change. She was no longer trying to resist Philip's decision. She was trying to understand how to live beside it. Louise then made the offer that finally eased the deepest fear. She told Anne that she could have unrestricted private access to Wood Farm whenever she wished. No permission. No awkward request. No sense that Philip's daughter had been pushed away from the place that carried so much of him. Anne accepted, but with one condition. Nothing meaningful inside the farm was to be removed simply because it was inconvenient, old, or difficult to maintain. Louise agreed immediately. The tension did not disappear, but it softened. The paperwork had been settled. What remained could only be resolved without papers, advisors, or anyone else in the room. The turning point came without an announcement. Anne and Louise returned to Wood Farm alone, leaving aides and relatives elsewhere. Inside the place Philip had guarded so fiercely, Anne stopped treating the decision as an inheritance dispute and began seeing it through her father's eyes. Louise did not try to defend herself. She simply admitted she still did not know why Philip chose her. Anne, surrounded by the evidence of his habits and priorities, suddenly realized that might have been the answer. Anne had come back for one reason. She wanted to see what Louise would actually do with the responsibility she had accepted. Wood Farm mattered because it had been one of Philip's most private refuges, a place where routine and usefulness mattered more than ceremony. Louise had resisted changing that rhythm. She had left the rooms largely untouched and begun cataloging only the items that genuinely needed preservation. Cataloging meant making a careful record of objects, their condition, and their importance, so nothing meaningful could quietly disappear. Anne noticed the restraint immediately. Louise finally admitted what she had been afraid to say. Every decision frightened her. If she repaired something, would Philip have approved? If she moved something, would Anne think she had gone too far? If she changed nothing, would the place slowly deteriorate under the weight of sentiment? Louise told her aunt that she feared disappointing both of them at once, the grandfather who had trusted her, and the daughter who had understood him long before she did. Anne did not answer quickly. Then she admitted something of her own. Her first reaction had not really been anger about Wood Farm. It had been the shock of feeling replaced in a part of Philip's life she believed she understood better than anyone. That confession changed the balance between them. Louise stopped looking like the recipient of a privilege. Anne stopped sounding like someone defending a claim. They became two people trying to protect the same memory from different directions. Louise then held out the key. No aides stood nearby. No family official softened the moment. She told Anne to keep it, if that would make Wood Farm feel less like something that had been taken away. Anne closed Louise's fingers around it. Philip had not chosen someone who desperately wanted Wood Farm, she told her. He had chosen someone who would hesitate to claim it. That was the difference. Service without entitlement, accepting responsibility without believing it makes you superior, had always mattered to him. Louise finally understood. Anne did too. The decision had never been a verdict against Philip's children. It had been a final expression of the values he trusted most. By the time Anne and Louise left Wood Farm together, the family had found peace, just as the public discovered what Philip had done. The revelation escaped the private world of Sandringham with explosive force. What fascinated Britain was not simply that Philip had chosen a granddaughter. It was which granddaughter he chose, and why. Louise, one of the quieter young royals, suddenly became the center of a story about inheritance, character, and the private judgment of a formidable grandfather. Yet the image that ultimately defined the public reaction did not involve wealth. It involved Anne. Louise felt the pressure almost immediately. News coverage framed Philip's decision as a surprising break from what many assumed would happen to such a deeply personal royal refuge. And that mattered because Wood Farm carried emotional meaning far beyond its practical value. Commentators quickly focused on Louise's long connection with carriage driving and on Philip's habit of rewarding discipline rather than display. Carriage driving is the demanding sport of controlling horses, pulling a carriage through precise movements and difficult conditions, and it had become one of the clearest bonds between grandfather and granddaughter. Louise hated that connection being turned into spectacle. Anne understood the danger from another direction. She knew her first shock could easily be reshaped into a story of family resentment, and she refused to allow that. The princess did not pretend the discovery had been painless, but she made it clear, through a documented palace briefing, that Louise had not taken anything from her. That distinction mattered. Anne's hurt came from memory, not jealousy, and she would not let public fascination turn her niece into an enemy. Then one front page captured the mood. A fictional morning newspaper appeared with the words, "Philip's Quiet Choice," stretched across the page beside a photograph of Anne and Louise leaving Sandringham in the same car. The image changed the tone instantly. Instead of two women divided by an inheritance, the public saw aunt and niece moving forward together. Louise saw the page and reportedly lowered it almost at once, uncomfortable with becoming the face of a story she had never sought. Louise faced an even more personal moment outside the Sandringham gates. A small crowd had gathered, waiting quietly rather than shouting. When her car passed, restrained applause rose from the roadside. The reaction caught her by surprise. She had expected judgment. Instead, she heard something closer to approval for the way she had handled Philip's trust. Palace messaging followed the same line. The emphasis stayed on stewardship, protecting something for its meaning rather than treating it as a prize, and on family continuity, not wealth. That language mirrored the philosophy inside Philip's documented letters almost exactly. Anne saw that the public had finally begun to understand. But she also knew understanding needed one last act of certainty. The public had formed its judgment. Now Anne would deliver the verdict that mattered most. In the end, Wood Farm did not divide Philip's family. It revealed something about him. His final choice was never about rewarding the person closest to a title, the throne, or the center of royal power. It was about choosing someone he believed would preserve a place without needing to possess its meaning. Anne had been stunned because she loved her father deeply. Louise had been frightened because she loved him too. That shared truth finally transformed Philip's surprise into reconciliation. Anne no longer treated the decision as a wound. She accepted Louise's stewardship both privately and through a documented family statement, ending any suggestion that the choice had created a lasting rupture. Stewardship meant responsibility without absolute personal claim, and that distinction had become the heart of Philip's final message. Louise promised that Wood Farm would remain a quiet family refuge, protected from unnecessary change and tied to the man who had found peace there during his later years. Anne returned Philip's original letters to their protective file with a care that said more than any speech could. She later told Charles that she no longer saw Wood Farm as something taken from her. The king understood immediately. Philip's decision had never erased the bond between father and daughter. If anything, it had forced Anne to confront how much that bond still mattered, even after his death. Charles listened as she admitted that what first felt like rejection now looked more like one final lesson in how their father measured character. Louise reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction. She told Edward and Sophie during a private family conversation that she did not intend to measure success by ownership, attention, or status. She would measure it by one simple question. Years from now, would Wood Farm still feel like Philip's place? Edward told his daughter that was probably the only answer her grandfather would have wanted. Sophie agreed, reminding her that preserving a legacy often means knowing what not to change. Anne finally faced Louise at Wood Farm after one last family visit. The tension that had once existed between them was gone. Before leaving, she gave her niece the simplest instruction possible. "Look after it properly." Louise answered without hesitation. "I will." Nothing more was needed. Anne now understood Philip's deepest vote of confidence. He had not merely handed Louise a valuable place. He had trusted her with something emotionally irreplaceable. The family accepted the principle beneath that choice. Responsibility mattered more than rank, and duty mattered more than possession. Philip's last surprise had begun with Anne's shock, but it ended with understanding. Wood Farm belonged to Louise's care, Philip's memory belonged to them all, and the family could finally let his decision stand in peace. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.